All right, so this is going to be our talk on nutrition, and we're going to go through just, again, some basics. There's a lot of different things when talking about diet and what's the optimal diet for various things. What we're going to do is cover some basic nutritional information for active individuals. What are some optimal things for individuals competing in athletics as far as what they should be getting regarding their macronutrients, micronutrients, and their pre-competition meals. So just to reference our material, since neither of the textbooks we use in the course really get in depth in nutrition, but of course, given what we're talking about with a lot of these systems and again, kind of optimizing health, we included nutrition within this course. I essentially used information from 2 chapters in the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, and just kind of combined parts that I felt would be appropriate for this class into one discussion. So that's the primary source where most of this information was attained from. So some key terms to kind of understand regarding nutrition, because again, this could kind of give you awareness as far as like what we should be getting as far as our nutrients are concerned. So the recommended dietary allowance is the average daily nutrient requirement adequate for meeting the needs of most healthy people within each life stage and sex. So that's again going to be what's going to be, essentially the basic needs for most individuals. Adequate intake is the average daily nutrient intake level established when an RDA cannot be established. So if an RDA can't be established, they have what's called adequate intake. The tolerable upper level intake is the maximum average daily nutrient level not associated with any adverse effects. So basically, if you do take, there are certain things that if you take in above that, there is the potential for adverse effects. You have the estimated average requirement, which is the average daily nutrient intake level considered sufficient to meet the needs of half of the healthy population. So again, looking at all of this, there's going to be things that we recommend for just the average individual. Obviously, for athletes and individuals involved in more strenuous activity, there could be a need for a little bit more. So that's something to consider even outside of this discussion, and we'll mention some of that when we kind of get into kind of for optimal performance for individuals who are very physically active. So when we look at our macronutrients, so a macronutrient is a nutrient that is required in significant amounts in the diet. And we have our 3 macronutrients, and we're going to talk about the requirements and essentially what they do. So we have proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. So those are our macronutrients, and these are where we're going to make up the bulk of our diet. All right, so looking at our proteins, so we're going to go through all the macronutrients. Proteins are the primary structural and functional component of really every cell in the human body, and there's various responsibilities of proteins. One of the big things is they help to build and repair cells. They also serve as enzymes, transport carriers, and hormones. So proteins do a lot within the body. And, in order to maintain health, reproduction, cellular structure, and function, proteins are really important. And proteins are made up of amino acids. And 4 of the amino acids can be synthesized by the body and are considered non-essential amino acids because they don't need to be consumed in the diet. 9 of them are essential because they cannot be manufactured and they're in the body, and therefore they need to be obtained through the diet. And then you have what are called conditionally essential. Now, conditionally essential still need to be consumed through the diet because you can't, again, the body doesn't make them. They're typically not considered essential, but during times period, for instance, of illness and stress, the body needs them. So they still need to be kind of be taken in through the diet. Here are our what we consider essential, non-essential, and conditionally essential amino acids. So you see the 9 essential amino acids, you see the non-essential, and again the conditionally essential. Again, they still need to be consumed through the diet. So the only ones that don't need to be consumed are your non-essential, so your alanine, asparagine, aspartic acid, and glutamic acid do not need to be consumed in the diet. So when we look at protein digestibility, that's something that gets calculated based on how much of the protein's nitrogen is absorbed during digestion. And that's going to be really important as it relates to how our body is able to actually use the proteins. So, we think of proteins particularly for the ability to kind of build and help repair muscle. So in order for protein to really be effective with that, you need to have your higher quality proteins, and they tend to be more highly digestible. So, and this is really your animal-based proteins that are really high as far as protein digestibility. So again, your eggs, dairy, meat, fish, poultry, they all contain all the essential amino acids. Really, the only plant-based protein that contains all 8 essential amino acids is soy. So, and in general, plant proteins tend to be less digestible. So again, if you have an individual who doesn't consume animal proteins, they really have to be intentional about selecting the right plant proteins in order to get all of their amino acids that they need to really get the most out of the protein that they're consuming. When we look at the protein requirements, so the RDA for protein for adults is about 0.8 grams per kilogram or 0.36 grams per pound. Now, the issue with that is that that's not going to be enough. If you have a physically active person, so take for instance a person who strength trains, they're likely going to need more protein for that. So that's the basic protein requirement for men and women. But when you start to talk about protein requirements for active individuals, that in all likelihood is going to have to be increased. So in looking at further at protein requirements, so what we call the acceptable macronutrient distribution range for protein, and it kind of varies a little bit. So when we're talking adult men and women, we say about 10 to 30% of the total calories. Now again, we'll be mentioning some things later on as to how there could be some variation with this. For younger children, particularly for ages 1 to 3, they recommend about 5 to 20%. They recommend 10 to 30% of the total calories for children 4 to 18 years of age. So again, there's some variation there. Now, the average consumption is about 15% for adult men and women. And again, the AMDR for nutrient includes a range of intakes that is associated with reduced risk of chronic diseases while still providing the appropriate nutrients. So, we have to look at this again as being a range. Now, however, when diets tend to change, so for instance, if calorie intake tends to be a little lower, they want the protein to increase a little bit more relative to the percentage. If the calories have to go up, again, for an active person or maybe somebody looking to put on weight, the percentage is going to go down. Now, you may increase the amount of protein you take in, but the percentage is going to go down relative to your other macronutrients. So there's some concerns about the RDA for protein. I sort of mentioned this earlier. For bone health, they actually may recommend that adults take in more than the recommended daily allowance that we talked about. They also talk about how consistently high protein intakes may compromise carbohydrate and fat intake. So again, you have to take into consideration your total calories. Many times individuals, when they're basically coming up with diets for people, so when sport dietitians are coming up with diets for athletes, usually what they determine first is actually the protein intake, and then they add the carbohydrates and fats on top of that, and that just kind of balances everything out and kind of allows them to kind of set those standards for everybody. Okay, so looking at our next macronutrient, carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, their primary role is serve as an energy source. Now, interestingly enough, carbohydrates aren't considered an essential nutrient per se, because the body can break down other things. They could convert our amino acids and our fats into energy as well. However, carbohydrates are the easiest source of energy for the body to use. So from a dietary perspective, they kind of provide us with a little bit more of an immediate source, a little bit of an easier source of energy production, particularly for active individuals. Now, our carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we have three different categories of carbohydrates. We have our monosaccharides, which is your glucose, fructose, and galactose. There are single sugar molecules. So in the body, glucose is present as circulating sugar in the blood, and that's where it can be our primary energy substrate for cells. So, our glucose molecules also make up glycogen, which is actually a polysaccharide that gets stored in the muscle and liver cells that can be utilized as an energy source as well. However, in food, glucose is typically combined with other monosaccharides to form various sugars, such as sucrose, which is actually one of our disaccharides. So, and there's various other forms, and again, the glucose, fructose, and galactose are essentially our single sugar molecules, which, like I said, get combined with, for instance, disaccharides, which is when you have two simple sugars joined together. That's your sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So, for instance, sucrose, which is the easiest example of that is your table sugar, is the most common disaccharide. That's a combination of glucose and fructose. Lactose is a combination of glucose and galactose, and that's what you find in milk. And maltose is basically two glucose molecules combined together. We look at our polysaccharides. There are complex carbohydrates, and they contain up to thousands of glucose units. Some of our more important or more common polysaccharides are our starches, fiber, and then our glycogen. So starch is what we look at as far as our is the storage form of glucose in plants. So our grains, legumes, vegetables, there are all good sources for starch. Starch can be used as a source of energy, however, it has to be broken down in order to do so. We also have our dietary fiber, which is a constituent of the plant cell wall and is also a carbohydrate. So there's various forms of fibers. Fibers have different physiologic effects on the body. Some delay gastric emptying, which may temporarily cause that feeling of fullness you get when you eat them, whereas others increase the bulk and water content, which helps to reduce constipation. And some of our soluble fibers actually help in the absorption of cholesterol and may help actually reduce blood cholesterol after digestion. So our fiber kind of takes on, and again, they would fall under the polysaccharides when we're looking at our different forms of carbohydrates. So something to note with carbohydrates, they talk about the glycemic index. So the glycemic index classifies a food by high and low for how long it takes to raise blood glucose. So foods that are digested quickly and raise blood glucose have what we would call have a high GI, and foods that take a little bit longer to digest and slowly increase blood glucose have what would be classified as a low glycemic index. So as far as the application of the whole glycemic index, so originally it was thought that the glycemic index was basically developed to help people control their blood sugar levels. So obviously that's helpful for somebody with diabetes. However, it's also been hypothesized that diets that have lower versus high glycemic index foods, they could also help reduce the risk of obesity and other diseases. However, the issue with glycemic index is that there's other things that affect it. So there's all of the proposed, as you'll see on the next table, foods that are low GI, medium GI, and high. However, there's even variations within certain types of food. For instance, the ripeness of certain food will cause slight changes. The method in which the food is processed and cooked could also change it. Also, the overall content of the meal. So consuming carbohydrates as a part of a meal or in different quantities can also affect the glycemic index. So it's more than just eating the food by itself, obviously, because you're going to be consuming many times these foods with other things. That also kind of impacts the glycemic index. So it does get a little more complicated than just saying, oh, this food is going to affect your blood sugar in this fashion. Because if you do eat it with other things, or if it's processed differently, it could impact the glycemic index. So here in general is what we consider low, medium, and high glycemic index foods. Now, if athletes are going to use glycemic index, or someone's going to use glycemic index as kind of like a marker for, what they should be eating, they recommend that individuals who are going to use the glycemic index to guide their choices, that they can try pre-exercise low and high glycemic index foods, while sticking with high glycemic index foods during exercise to provide immediate source of energy. And also immediately after exercise, also use high glycemic index to help replenish their glycogen stores. So again, try for pre-exercise, it's a good combination to try low and high glycemic index foods. Another thing you could even do is, even with a higher glycemic index food, maybe combine it with a little bit of fat, just so that your blood sugar doesn't spike too much and you don't have this big insulin rush and have a slight drop in your blood sugar before you exercise, because obviously you want to make sure that you manage that so that your energy is efficient for that. And I mentioned fiber already. So again, fiber is going to be important for various reasons. So again, diets low in fiber tend to be associated with a lot of different diseases: heart disease, colon cancer, type 2 diabetes. The DRI for fiber ranges from about 21 to 29 grams a day and 30 to 38 grams a day for young men and women respectively. And again, the level of fiber may be excessive for some aerobic endurance athletes. So that may be a little high, and again, you may have to modify it. Obviously, we know fiber is commonly found in fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, all types of whole grain products. Again, for just overall dietary health, they kind of generally recommend that amount. Again, you may have to just watch with some aerobic endurance athletes, particularly as you get closer to an event, just because there is the potential that they can cause some gas and possibly some stomach upset. So carbohydrate requirements for athletes. So aerobic endurance athletes who train for long durations, they should replenish glycogen levels by consuming at least 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight. And it should be noted that carbohydrates provide around 4 calories per gram. So when you're trying to figure out, how your carbohydrates based on your calories, that's what you would be looking at as far as the energy or the calories that they would provide. So just a key point to note, again, athletes can adapt dietary changes to carbohydrate intake. So again, although individuals who consume carbohydrates will use them as a source, particularly during aerobic exercise, consistent intake of a low carbohydrate diet will eventually lead to a greater reliance on fat as a source of fuel. So again, athletes can adapt to that over time. So I did mention the requirements for aerobic athletes. Athletes who do participate in strength, sprint, skill-based activities, they still typically need at least 5 to 6 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. So that would be, again, just to kind of provide them with sustained energy. And it's obviously popular nowadays. You hear about a lot of diets that restrict carbohydrates. Again, they can lead to a greater reliance on the fat as a fuel source. However, sometimes that requires some amount of adaptation. So you do have to be concerned that, if an athlete all of a sudden decided to change to a low carbohydrate diet, it could at least initially possibly lead to some struggles with their energy.